Hey everyone, John Wojciechowski here. I hope you're all having a great day. And so I'm going to have to do a format that's a little bit different because I'm going to be combining lectures and switching from one to the other, okay? So let's just go ahead and get started. One of the things I want to talk about today is World War I, but the thing we need to talk about first are some of the antecedents or the earlier opportunities where the United States was getting involved in international affairs. So we have to look at this period of imperialism and global involvement at this time. And one of the ways I like to think about this period is the fact that after 1860, there really isn't this way for men to show that or prove that they are men or manly or masculine or anything like that. People aren't taking pride in their work anymore. People are approaching life from a social Darwinist, this deterministic or fatalistic approach to life, that life really doesn't have meaning. So a lot of people are going to start engaging in blood sports and trying to break from the monotony of their everyday lives. And one of the things that's also going on is that since men don't have a way to prove their manliness, there's this need or this desire to go to war as well. And this is what the point of this slide is that there are no wars to fight for men, okay? Since 1865, after the Civil War has ended, the United States has gone 30 years without having any major conflicts, okay? And this is something that allowed people to forget how bloody and deadly the Civil War was. This was a conflict where more Americans died than all other wars combined. This was just a truly atrocious event. But after having about 30 years, people are starting to reminisce about how good the Civil War was. That was this time where men could be men, where they could prove their masculinity, that the United States can revere these soldiers, revere them for their losses. And this is something that's still really held, or this is something that was valued by the 1890s. And so a lot of people are wanting to go to war and trying to prove their manliness, their masculinity, and other senses, okay? So yeah, as you can see, in spite of the great losses, many veterans were getting older and becoming reminiscent for that time in their lives. Many young men wanted to prove their masculinity, but had no outlet to do it because there were no wars to fight. But during the 1890s, by 1900, we can see this map of colonial possessions among all of these different nations, okay? So as you can see here, the United States is going to control certain pieces of land over here in the Pacific. It's kind of hard to see all of the different places that the United States owns. They're going to control part of the Philippines for a while. They're going to own Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico. As you can see, Puerto Rico, U.S. They're independent, but they're going to be controlled by the United States as well. But if you look in Africa, you can see French West Africa, French Indochina, which is Vietnam. Belgium is going to own Belgian Congo. This is something that's part of the international political climate of this time. All of these nations in Western civilization are going out and they're colonizing and expanding their empire to other parts of the world. You know, there's that famous quote about Great Britain that the sun never set on the British Empire. So you can see they owned Canada, Australia, India, Burma, and many of these different countries in Africa as well. Okay, so this is just part of it. And the United States recognizes that this is an opportunity for them to go out and to expand their own empire as well. Okay. So by 1900, imperialism became an important method for the United States to help overly civilized men release their pent-up energies. During the 1890s, Franklin Roosevelt, before he was a president, was able to show off his masculinity as a Rough Rider in the U.S. Or in the Spanish-American War. Went to Cuba, was able to take the San Juan Hill. This was something that was able to help him transform the way people viewed him in their eyes. Before this, many of his political opponents thought that he was soft, that he was weak. Some of them would call him names and even use derogatory terms, calling him gay essentially as well, which is awful to think about. But they were doing all these things to show that he was too feminine, that he was too overly civilized. So Roosevelt especially, even though he's a progressive president, being a progressive doesn't necessarily mean that you're only looking out for social reform, but was also focusing on this point of expanding Americanism, of taking what it means to be an American and showing other people this way. It's about the exceptionalism of the American character as well, okay? So they're trying to reform people, they're trying to help people by helping them get rid of their culture and adopting an American culture instead. So William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson led campaigns to save the world and civilize its inhabitants with the American spirit. Okay, and this is American imperialism. I really like this political cartoon because you can see that the wings of the eagle are covering from Puerto Rico to Samoa, Hawaii, Manila, and the Philippines. Yeah, and then a couple of other islands in the South Pacific as well. And Cuba should also be on this map. That was one of their rewards from the Spanish-American War, was claiming Cuba also. But American exceptionalism is this belief central to American political culture since the Revolution that Americans have a unique mission among nations to spread freedom and democracy. And so for the purpose of this online course, I'm only going to look at involvement in the Spanish-American War as the beginning of American imperialism. You can argue that American imperialism goes all the way back to the U.S.-Mexican War, or you can look at the Trail of Tears as the beginning of American imperialism, as well as they're taking away Indian lands and making them more American. But for the purpose of this course, we're going to focus essentially and specifically on the 1890s, 1920s, okay? Because this is a period that's going to lead into World War I, and we're going to see that the United States, as you can tell, they're not actually trying to go after any of these countries in Africa or in the Near East or the Far East either. They're mostly focusing on this sphere of influence. And there's a reason for that as well, and we're going to see how that all fits in with World War I as well. Okay, so the Spanish-American War began in 1898, and it was the result of American intervention in the ongoing Cuban War of Independence with Spain. Cuba had been one of Spain's last imperial possessions. It was known as the obedient servant for a long time because there had been no revolutions. If you look into Latin American history, all of these countries in South America rebelled against the Spanish monarchy during the 1800s. So from about 1810 until 1840, all of these countries eventually declare independence away from Spain. Mexico will do so in about 1820, 1830 as well. So Cuba is one of the last obedient Spanish possessions, and yet they're ready to also cast off the Spanish monarchy. Cuba was important as a sugar colony, and so a lot of Spanish investors went into Cuba and completely transformed the landscape to producing sugar. Okay, so they're cutting down all of the rainforest, making these giant sugar plantations, using all of the wood to fire the engines necessary to process the sugar. And so a lot of Cubans realize that they're only viewed specifically within this context, that they're only valuable for their sugar, and that Spain is really ruining and is being very detrimental to their actual economy and to their ability to support themselves as well, because they're going to become dependent on Spain for everything else. And when you're dependent on another nation for everything that you need to eat or to subsist or to survive, then that country can charge whatever prices it wants. So Cuba is interested in freeing itself from this bond so that it can determine its prices, its trade partners, who it works with, who it deals with, everything like that. Okay, and so one of the interesting things about the Spanish-American War is that this was an opportunity for the American North and South to repair their differences. The war gave both sides a common enemy for the first time since the end of the Civil War in 1865, and many friendships were formed between soldiers of northern and southern states during their tours of duty. So this also helped with that reconciliation that would take place between the North and the South. Especially when we look at the 1890s, this is the time where everyone is really coming back together and deciding how they're going to remember the Civil War, okay, and how they're going to rewrite history about it as well. The war marked American entry into world affairs. This is really significant. Before this time, the United States was incredibly isolationist. They believed in this idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which is we're going to take care of the Western Hemisphere. Everyone else the old world can worry about itself and its colonial possessions, but we don't believe in the old world anymore. We believe that the old world is broken, that the American way of life is the best, and so the United States says that it's going to take care of the countries within its orbit, but it's not going to allow the old world into the Western Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere isn't going to go into the old world either, okay? So the new world and the old world are going to be separate in international affairs. The only reason why they would ever work together is through trade relationships, but there's not going to be much diplomacy, there aren't going to be territorial acquisitions, anything like that. And yet this is the first time where the United States is actually going into Cuba and is getting involved in international affairs. It's actually actively helping Cuba out, essentially, as we'll see that this might not necessarily be the case. Okay, but yeah, so this is a chance for them to enter into world affairs and to actually enter into a conflict to protect someone in the Western Hemisphere as well. And so the defeat of Spain in this war marked the end of the Spanish Empire. And so one of the reasons why the United States was able to justify entering into this conflict was, remember the Maine. The Spanish-American War was sparked by an explosion that went off on the USS Maine. It was this giant battleship that was docked off of, anchored off of Cuba. It blew up. 260 sailors died, and many journalists said that this was an attack from the Spanish. Most likely this was an operator error, and one of the boilers exploded near a cache of gunpowder, causing the ship to sink. Regardless, newspapers picked up the story and highlighted the Spanish as the enemy. And so this created all of the necessary energy and political support for the United States to actually engage with the Spanish and to overthrow their rule in Cuba. And so something that happened out of this is this idea of yellow journalism. It's journalism that is based upon sensationalism and crude exaggeration. Okay, so we see that this is the New York Journal. Sounds like a valid, legit newspaper, but as you can see, look at all the different places where it says $50,000 reward. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. Assistant Secretaries Roosevelt convinced the explosion of the warship was not an accident. It's not really based in facts. It's all based in what people have said, what they've heard, exaggerating the facts, exaggerating the truth, not necessarily getting everything down that is necessary. And so one of the reasons why we can think about this as being a significant piece of American history is that yellow journalism is essentially fake news. It's trying to trick people into believing something that isn't based in fact. Okay, so this has been happening all the way back since the 1890s and even earlier. This is something where sensationalism, even though it looks like it's from a legit source, I mean, why shouldn't you trust something called the New York Journal? But it's still not, it's the veracity of this journal still isn't proven or true or anything like that. And so we need to be able to discern the truth, be able to question sources, always make sure that whatever we read is based in fact. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why we study history, is to attune our senses to understanding when we're reading something that seems true or seems accurate, and knowing how to research to figure out if these sources are actually true or accurate as well. Okay? And so this war went by really quickly. It lasted only about 6 months. And the United States fought this war not even that long. I think it was only about 90 days. I'll have to look that up. But the United States fought this war in the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, and Puerto Rico. They gained access to these territorial possessions and ended the Spanish Empire. Okay, and the United States influenced these island nations by passing legislation such as the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment was a significant piece of legislation that gave the United States the right to govern Cuba. They could have soldiers stationed there. They would make most of the political decisions for Cuba, or they would have to approve all of Cuba's political decisions. So Cuba wasn't a sovereign nation at this time. It wasn't able to self-govern. It had to pass everything by the United States. Okay, so in a sense, it seems like Cuba has given up one imperial power and has adopted another one. And this is a political cartoon that was published in, I think, Cuba or somewhere around there. And what this is the iron of the house. Okay, so it's essentially the brand of the house. As you can see, Cuba has now been is now tied to a post and is being branded by the United States. Okay, and yeah, Uncle Sam is in here in the background approving this decision. So you can see that a lot of people weren't happy by this decision because it seems like they're fighting a war for independence so that they could rule themselves, but now they're going to be ruled by the United States. And after the Spanish-American War, a Filipino revolution took place as well, as they tried to fight for independence. Okay, so nationalists wanted to be self-determining, wanted to make sure that they were making all of the right choices for their own people, and didn't want the United States to govern them. So the Filipino nationalists fought for their independence, but were harshly put down by the American forces. The war resulted in estimated 34,000 to 220,000 Philippine casualties. It's always difficult to tell how many people actually died or were injured, with more civilians dying from disease and hunger brought about by war. One of the things that happened was that the United States disestablished the Roman Catholic Church as a state religion, creating more opportunities for Protestant missionaries to come into the Philippines to evangelize the people there. We see that even though the native language was English in the islands as the primary language of government English would replace Spanish as the primary language of government, education, business, and industry, increasingly in future decades of families and educated individuals. Okay, so we can see that the United States is replacing the entire culture of the Philippines because of this notion of American exceptionalism. And remember, this is a progressive idea as well. It's okay to it's okay to change people's cultures and ways of thinking because they were wrong in the past. It's essentially, think about you can make it. It's essentially the same argument as why it's okay to apply science into the Food and Drug Act. Before, we thought one way was okay. We thought it was okay to just dump chemicals on rotten meat and put it back in the hopper. But now we realize that it's better to use science. It's essentially saying that the Philippines, before we thought it was okay for them to be Catholics and to speak Spanish, but now it's better for them to be Protestants and to speak English. Essentially, I think that's one way to understand this transformation. People didn't really see how this was problematic or would have caused a lot of problems for the Filipinos as well. And the fighting in the Philippines was particularly brutal, as you can tell by the number of casualties. Many of them died in combat. Most of them died from disease as well, as the previous slide said. But for the prisoners of war, they were tortured and given all sorts of awful treatment as they tried to figure out where different leaders were who were fighting in this conflict. And so one of the forms of American torture was called the water cure, as you can see here. They would basically hold people down and force water into their mouths. It was kind of a mixture of water poisoning and waterboarding. If they refused to drink it, they pour it down their nose, trying to simulate the sensation of drowning. But then, they would just constantly be pouring water on them as a horrible way of torture. And so there was this group of people known as the Anti-Imperialist League who saw how hypocritical and wicked this method of imperialism was. As you can see, this is one of the political cartoons that they passed. Expansion, the water cure method of extorting from Uncle Sam the confession that an empire is better than a republic. And so there weren't that many people who were part of the Anti-Imperialist League, but they were very influential in bringing to the spotlight many of the issues with expansionism. So the imperial measure administers the administration repeal of the Declaration of Independence, supervision of Monroe Doctrine, military despotism, violation of rules of war, government by injunction. So he's saying that the United States is no longer a republic, but it's becoming an autocracy, an aristocracy, a plutocracy, and feudalism. So it's becoming warlike. There are monarchs who are leading this nation. There are certain people who are essentially ruling because they believe that it is their right to, and not that they were popularly elected or anything like that. Okay, you can see that a lot of the prominent politicians of the time are dressed like little demons as well. So we can see that people do recognize the problems with this method as well. And so from a modern perspective, progressives had many good ideas in terms of child labor, democratizing politics, and cleaning up the cities. However, we can see that progressives in power had a monolithic view of what it meant to be an American. They wanted to fit everyone into this category, into the American category, or else control them if they did not believe that they were capable of becoming Americans. So this is a really famous political cartoon from magazine called Puck, and as you can see, these are all of the peoples who were already brought into American politics. And so Uncle Sam says school begins, and he's going to try to teach Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii, and the Philippines to become good children like these. But we can also see that there is there are problems with believing in that they're going to that the United States is actually going to treat them fairly, because as you can see here, Native Americans are off in the corner on their essentially reservation away from everyone else who has become a state. We see that Chinese people are excluded, that they're not even allowed into the school, and that African Americans aren't allowed to learn either, but are forced to clean the building, to be janitors, to not actually have full equal rights. So we can see that it's this political commentary on how people who have bought into the American system haven't truly been able to become equal or free in this democratic society. And so this is one of the problems with racism in the progressive era, is that, I think I've already showed this slide before, but Jim Crow wasn't only in the North, or wasn't only in the South, but was also in the North as well. They were segregated in what are called restrictive covenants, clauses, and property titles that preventing owners from selling to racial minorities. They could not join unions and were hated because there were scabs during strikes as well. So African Americans were looked down upon as being scabs, but because they weren't allowed to join the union and needed the work as well. Many African Americans could not move to the suburbs, but had to stay in dilapidated housing. And this is one of those. So this is a clause from one of those contracts. And you can see racial restrictions. No property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. No person other than one of the white or Caucasian race shall be permitted to occupy any property in said addition or portion thereof or building thereon except a domestic servant. So you can see the only reason why a black person would be allowed in this neighborhood was if they were going to be a domestic servant. And I always think it's interesting that racial restrictions is right above animals, that we're getting to the point of restrictions, and it's so dehumanizing as well to look at people of different races and say that they're right above animals, for which animals can be in these neighborhoods is not. And yeah, we talked about Birth of a Nation a little bit. Can't reiterate enough how lynching cases increased during this time. On average, there were 75 lynching cases per year between 1900 and 1920. The majority of these were cases involving black men. Tom Shipp and Abe Smith, these were cases that shows how they became public events. People went out to in a really, really sick way celebrate these events. These were community events where they were where they showed off that they could protect their communities, essentially, even though these men weren't prosecuted, didn't have their day in court, were most likely innocent as well. So horrible things like that. And so when we look at progressives and African Americans, most progressives viewed African Americans like immigrants, not as potential allies, but as part of the problem. In the view of many progressives, including Theodore Roosevelt, immigrants could become Americans, but blacks could not. Progressives generally support or tolerated segregated schools and housing, restrictions on black voting rights, and moral oversight of black communities. Okay, and so we've gone over these slides before. Important thing as well is that eugenics movement was really popular during this time. In fact, Adolf Hitler developed his ideas of eugenics and pure races of Germans through American eugenics programs. Okay, so this is the belief that certain people shouldn't be allowed to reproduce, and that they can be, or that they should be, sterilized to help improve society and to improve the American stock as well. Okay, so we can see here different men holding signs. I cannot read the sign, but what right have I, children? Would the prisons and asylums be filled if my kind had no children? I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the craving to others? This is these men who are suggesting that if sterilization was approved and okay, then there would be more people who were alcoholics, criminals, insane, all sorts of things like that. And so these are some of the problems with the progressives. Okay, but the reason I just wanted to start here because I wanted to make sure that we focus on imperialism and America's first foray into internationalist politics as well, taking an internationalist approach. Okay, so let's head over to World War I. And one of the things that we need to look at are some of the statistics. There has never been a war like, well, I shouldn't say that because World War II absolutely trumped World War I. But up to this point in modern Western civilization, there had never been a war like this. 16.5 million deaths, 20 million wounded. Total World War I casualties, 35 million plus. You can see just all the statistics of how many people lost their lives or were injured during this conflict. And there are many reasons for this. A lot of poor planning, trench warfare, armies not being able, or generals not being able to adapt to new modern forms of technology or warfare. And so we have to ask ourselves, how did all of this happen? Okay, so we can start to recognize that the coming of the war began in 1872. By 1872, many Germans were convinced that Germany had lagged in the race for empire, so they pursued modernization, building up modern armies, exploring new technology to be used in battlefields. And Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy signed a military defense treaty in 1882. France, Great Britain, and Russia signed similar treaties in 1904 and 1907. So you can see how the lines are starting to be drawn in the sand, how certain countries are becoming allies as well. And so we can see that the alliances were Italy, Germany, Austria, Hungary. The Ottoman Empire is kind of on the outside, but more aligned with Germany and Austria, Hungary, because we're going to look at the complexities of these issues, okay? But the Ottoman Empire is going to play an interesting role in how this all broke out as well. Okay, so you can see that there are military expansions, alliances forming, with Central Europe being surrounded by its enemies. Just another map. But yeah, as you can see, Serbia independent formally since 1878. And the reason why this is significant is that before Serbia is able to, or Serbia acknowledges itself as a independent power, but before it was owned by, or was a possession of, the Ottoman Empire as well. Okay, and so this is kind of where Turkey is, all of these lands. The Ottoman Empire is known as the sick man of Europe. It is this country, or it was this empire that had so much prominence in European history. As you can, if you look into European history, you can see a lot of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire and how the Ottoman Empire tried to expand its influence into Eastern Europe, but many forces tried to close that off as well, or prevent that from happening as well. Okay, we've already talked about this, the Spanish-American War, but we can also talk about how Teddy Roosevelt took the Canal Zone, helped build the Panama Canal as well, which is a fantastic innovation in American trade, because instead of having to go all the way around South America, a lot of people will be able to cut right through Central America and save a lot of time on their trade. Okay, and Roosevelt corollary gave U.S. international police power in the Caribbean. This reaffirmed the Monroe Doctrine, saying, we'll stand our side, you guys stand your side. The New World and the Old World will not really mix or be involved in any political discourse. Okay, and they also opened the door with Chinese trade as well. Okay, so before, the Chinese weren't allowed to really come over to the United States, but now we're getting to a point where trade is increasing. The United States is becoming stronger trade allies with China as well. So yeah, the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe. Turkey loses hold of southeastern Europe in the 1870s. Left in the wake are new, weak, independent states of Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia. They're trying to maintain their independence. And this is what Slavic nationalism is all about, is that they'll be able to govern themselves and rule over themselves as well without, so right here, Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania, these countries are all trying to remain independent because they were able to free themselves of the Ottoman Empire, but now the Austro-Hungarian Empire is trying to absorb them and trying to make them a part of their empire now as well. Okay? And so Serbs called for this pan-Slavism and received support from Russia. Russia and most of Eastern Europe are Slavs, technically. So Poland, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Soviet Union, and most of Yugoslavia, all these people would be considered Slavic, essentially, okay? So we're starting to see why Russia would be siding with Serbia and Bosnia in this conflict as well. They're calling for this pan-Slavism, and Austria-Hungary is worried about Slavic nationalism, and with good reason, because there is this concern that Russia is going to join with them, and that they're going to lose more allies, that their empire is going to be further weakened by this new Slavic nationalism that is forming in around all of their neighbors, essentially. Okay, and this is just a chance to see where all of the Ottoman vilayets were, and how Bulgaria and all of these countries right next to Turkey broke off from the Ottoman Empire as well. Okay, so Austria-Hungary is still working really hard to try to take over these Slavic nations that have recently been nationalized, or are recently independent or nationalizing as well. And so, in an act of strong aggression, the future empire of the Ottoman, or of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, is traveling through Sarajevo in Bosnia, and Slavic terrorist assassinates the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Concerned about a larger Serbia, Austro-Hungary consults Germany. German response, Germany urges Austro-Hungary to stop Slavic nationalism. Serbia then turns to Russia for help, and Russia looks to France for assistance because Russia and France had that treaty from the past. So now we can see how the lines are being drawn in the sand. It's all about, and this is the reason why the Franz Ferdinand assassination is so significant. It's because now Austro-Hungary is turning to Germany. Germany is turning has their back and their support, and says we need to put down this movement. The Slavs in the Balkans want to maintain their independence, so they're turning to their large Slavic neighbor and ally in seeking help and assistance in this conflict. Okay. Here is Archduke Franz Ferdinand with his family, and his wife was with him in the car when he was assassinated, and she also died. Okay, the assassin was Gavrilo Princip, and he said, "I am a Yugoslav nationalist aiming for the unification of all Yugoslavs, and I do not care what form of state, but it must be freed from Austria. Austria, not Slavic, it is more Anglo-Saxon, essentially it's more Western Europe, they don't have the same values as Slavs, and would try to put down their culture as well. So World War I begins. In late July 1914, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, condemns Serbia as a haven for terrorists. In response, Russia mobilizes its armies to come to the defense of Serbia. Germany responds by declaring war on Russia on August 1st and on France on August 3rd. When Germany invades Belgium to get at France, England gives Germany an ultimatum. When Germany refuses to back down, England declares a war on Germany on August 4th. Germany is getting too close to France, which is really close to Great Britain, and so this is one of the reasons why England had to declare war and had to join alliances with the French as well. Okay, so the combatants, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, essentially. Turkey, they really can't offer much support, but they're going to do what they can. The Allies, Britain, France, Russia, Japan, Italy, and the core, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. The end of an era, essentially, is what's happening now. I mean, one of my professors always says that when we think about the 20th century, we view it for the innovations and how incredible this decade was in terms of technological growth and miracles of science leading to all sorts of advancements. But if we really think about it, the 20th century was this horrific century in which millions upon millions of people died all throughout the world in 2 world wars, several under several authoritarian regimes that just killed millions of people in Russia and and other places like that, and also the fear of the end of life as we know it from nuclear holocaust during the Cold War. All of these concerns form as nationalism is starting to rise up, and people are constantly fighting over and competing for ownership of different lands and different peoples as well. And so Sir Edward Grey said in a really famous quote that is very forward-thinking as well, and prescient about what is going to happen in the future, said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." For a long time there had been peace in Europe as these different kingdoms maintained their balances between one another, but now there's going to be conflict breaking out as well. And so you might be wondering what's going on with the United States. Why didn't the United States get involved in World War I until 1917? 3 years into this battle, or into this really deadly conflict, what's going on? They have other concerns going on at this time, and they're going to also want to be isolationists. They're going to want to isolate themselves from the old world. They're not interested in what's going on with the old world. That is their concerns. All they really care about are having partners, trade partners, building up their economy, things like that. In the United States, they have to deal with the Mexican Revolution, which was Mexico led a revolution against the exploitative leadership that owned a majority of the land. Many Mexican peasants wanted to have access to land, but their president, Porfirio Diaz, was much more interested in making sure that the wealthy had access to the land, and that also foreign traders and foreign partners had access to this land as well. So Mexico sparked a wave of revolutions that would take place in countries such as Russia and other Latin American nations. When we think about the first revolution, the first major revolution of the 20th century, we have to look at Mexico. And it was something where a lot of people believed that it was really performing the Marxist view of history, that there would be a proletariat revolution, that people who are working on the land would overthrow the landowners and eventually come to communal land ownership. So this is something where people are keeping their eyes on Mexico to see what's going to happen. And the United States is also interested because not only do they share a border and are neighbors, but the U.S. had oil interests and railroad interests in Mexico. And this revolution risked ruining these relationships, as Mexico would most assuredly nationalize these industries, and that is what happened. Mexico will form multiple companies that are all nationalized and work to serve Mexico's best interests. Okay. So Wilson sent forces into Mexico and blockaded the port of Veracruz to protect American interests. Pancho Villa, the famous revolutionary, raided the United States and led many attacks on border towns. Wilson reacted by sending 120,000 National Guardsmen into Mexico to capture Villa. Okay, so that was, it looks like it was even 150,000. So we can see that the United States is involved in some international affairs, but not what's going on over the Atlantic. So the U.S. remained neutral during these first 3 years. Like I said, remember the Roosevelt Corollary and the Monroe Doctrine. Old world, you take care of yourself. New world, we'll take care of ourselves. Europe wasn't going to be of American concerns. However, this was difficult for many Americans to agree with because many Americans had ancestral ties to England. Even Woodrow Wilson, who was president at this time, admired the British for their system of government. He preferred Parliament to most government structures, might even preferred it more to the way the United States was organized and run. And he was this Anglophile who loved English culture as well. So it's hard for him to stay out of this conflict. However, it was difficult to rally enough support for the United States to actually go and fight in this conflict. Okay, so the English language itself deepened the bond between Americans and the English as well. So, yep, Europe at war. These are the trenches that were carved out, and we see the fact that it's going to be a long, bloody war where Germany is going to have to fight on two fronts, an eastern front and a western front, and it's both going to be very deadly. Okay. So, America responds by a proclamation of neutrality. They aren't really going to be taking sides. They're going to offer different goods. They're going to offer weapons, food, resources to anyone who needs them. And this is the way where they're trying to profit off of the war. You know, they're going to be criticized as being merchants of death. Okay, but eventually they're going to be forced to trade exclusively with Great Britain because the British have naval supremacy. They're able to control the oceans. And Wilson is going to logically think through these issues and believe and promote this idea of Wilsonianism, where the United States should get involved in this conflict because they have this responsibility where Americans believe that they are the best culture, that they have perfected the old world ways of government, and that we can form a more peaceful society, a more peaceful world, if Americans are allowed to participate in creating a League of Nations or a way for there to be this international body where diplomacy will happen to prevent any future conflicts or major wars in the future. Okay, so these are some of the key elements of Wilsonianism to create a more peaceful international world: political liberty, freedom to vote, constitutional government, allowing each independent government and nation to have its own constitution that lays out what it values and how it's going to be structured and run. Individual rights, the rights of people outlined, social mobility, the ability for people to build themselves up and go from being lower class to middle or upper class through hard work. I'm not going to be promoting a caste system or a royalty. They're going to allow every person to become self-made. Free enterprise, private business operates in competition and largely free of state control. So that's essentially what we have today, in a lot of ways. The fact that the government isn't going to get involved in the marketplace unless it has to. Open diplomacy, governments to make arrangements with one another, and free trade or tariff-free trading. So this is going to show that countries don't have preference for one or the other, that the seas are open, and that it's free to trade at different ports. And this way, alliances are maintained and made stronger as well. Okay, so these are all ways that Woodrow Wilson believed that he could create a more peaceful world. Okay, so now we have to get to a strange neutrality, and like I said, the U.S. is going to be forced to help the British because the British controlled the seas. It was impossible or very difficult for American ships, merchant ships, to get to Germany to offload materials for them. Anytime that the United States was trying to fulfill an order for Germany, British warships, if they intercepted these American ships, would incarcerate or would arrest the crew and hold all of the cargo as contraband as well. So the United States was losing a lot of money by trying to trade with Germany. However, they didn't want to break this neutrality and show preference for one nation or the other. And so they're in this real tough spot as a result. Wilson, can he be neutral despite trading almost exclusively with the British? This is to show just how massive the disparity was between trade amounts. So exports from 1914 till 1916, U.S. exports rose from $753 million to $2.75 billion, and exports to Germany fell to $29 million. So the $2.75 billion of exports, Germany is only getting $29 million worth. Loans, $2.3 billion in loans to allies, $27 million to Germany. So what is Germany going to do? It's going to begin submarine warfare. If it's not able to profit or to have a fair shot at getting these materials, then they're going to sink American ships. Sink these merchant ships, because in their opinion, America has taken a stance on war. They are giving bullets to Great Britain that are killing German soldiers on the battlefield. They're giving food to British soldiers that are sustaining them to continue the fight against Germany. And so submarine warfare is going to break out, and Germany is going to be very effective at sinking a lot of ships. Okay. So Germany sunk merchant ships carrying contraband to protect itself. Some of these ships that were carrying contraband were also luxury ocean liners. So the Lusitania was carrying American citizens, and it was sunk by Germany. And so the United States was on the verge of declaring war against Germany after this act, but there were a few other crises that had to happen. So there were other ships that sunk that had American citizens on them, and the United States is telling Americans that they cannot ride on foreign vessels that are carrying contraband because there is a significant chance that they will be sunk. Okay. So, however, this is a difficult issue because Wilson is running for re-election in 1916, and he is running on this promise that he has kept the United States out of war. However, there are going to be other issues as well, such as Germany is going to try to is going to antagonize the United States by sending a telegram to Mexico telling them if they attack the United States and draw off American forces, and if Germany wins World War I, then Mexico will be able to reclaim its the territory it lost during the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s. So here are some political cartoons selling under false pretenses. British ship is flying an American flag, even saying, "Can't you see I'm a bloomin' Yankee?" So he is clearly supposed to be British, but that was one of the things, is that they would try to fly American flags to say that they were American vessels, so they couldn't be sunk since they weren't an aggressor. And that's one way that the British tried to get around it. TR and war, just making fun of him as being a warmonger, wanting war. Wilson is doing everything he can to keep the United States out of this conflict. You can see U.S. losses to German warships or German submarine campaign. Just tons and tons of materials lost. And also, these submarines weren't that big. I mean, it's kind of terrifying to think about how cramped, how narrow, how short this vessel is. So it'd be kind of terrifying to try to be on one of these submarines and trying to attack these other ships as well. Here's the Lusitania. You have warnings to not travel on the Lusitania because it is carrying contraband. Okay, and so Wilson responds, Lusitania won't tolerate German intervention. The Gore-Macklemore resolution tried to prohibit American citizens from traveling on foreign merchant vessels, and still, even after all of these issues with the Zimmermann telegram, the sinking of the Lusitania, there are still these peace movements that are promoting peace among Americans, prevent intervention. In this war that is between old world powers, there are no reasons why the United States should be involved in this conflict. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. You can see that there's this notion of peace that's breaking out. The fact that people don't want their children to fight in this conflict either. However, the United States is ultimately going to declare war after unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans are going to be sinking any and all ships that appear to be bringing war materials to Great Britain. The Zimmermann telegram, in which Mexico is offered the southwestern states if Germany is victorious. Our neutrality, the United States is preparing for war. It's building up its army. It's building up its ability to fight this war as well. And ultimately, the declaration of war. After Wilson is re-elected, he is going to justify this conflict by saying that neutrality is no longer feasible or desirable, where the peace of the world is involved and the freedom of its people. So we see that he's using this language of being of protecting liberty, of protecting democracy, and trying to protect it from autocratic governments backed by organized force, which is controlled wholly by their will, not the will of their people. Protecting democracy. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation. They're not looking for anything to gain. There's nothing for the United States to gain in this conflict other than to protect democracy. So as they're mobilizing for war, Congress is going to do everything to build up its military. The United States military at this time was fairly small, didn't really have a standing army, and so all men were required, between 21 and 30, were required to register with local draft boards. There were 24 million registered and nearly 3 million drafted. And the War Department for the first time is going to closely monitor recruits' off-duty behavior and activities. So the Commission on Training Camp Activities presented films, lectures, and posters on the dangers of alcohol and prostitution. Any soldier disabled by venereal disease, one poster warned, is a traitor. I like this one as well. You kept fit and defeated the Hun, which is a derogatory term for Austro-Hungary, a lot of until the Hun eventually landed in Hungary, and that's where we get the name. Now set a high standard to clean America, stamp out venereal disease. So don't have sex, be clean, be smart, and be prepared to fight for the United States. And for the first time, the United States is also testing men's IQs, and they were really shocked by how poorly most Americans performed. And one of the things that's interesting is that, I want to see if I have the IQ test here. I might have it on a different slideshow. Okay, yeah, I think I'll have to try to find that. I'll have to find that later. Sorry about that. But there were all kinds of questions in this IQ test that asks certain things that only native-born Americans would know. So it would ask questions about film stars from the time, certain architects, what is the color of a topaz, all sorts of things like that. And many of these people who, had arrived in the United States in 1904 or 1900 barely knew English, and so many of them bombed these tests because they could barely understand the questions. Since they were in English, they didn't have any chances to take an IQ test in another language. And so this was another way that the United States was able to show that white, native-born American soldiers are better prepared or are smarter, more intelligent, more desirable than Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Okay, trying to always show that the United States is better. This is a clip from a video about trench warfare and what it was like. If you get a chance, it's excellent. Be sure to view it if you'd like to learn a little bit more about what trench warfare was like. One of the interesting things that they mention in this clip is that the Germans actually were planning on having a long drawn-out war in the trenches, so they actually installed electricity, had wood planked floors, had really dry sanitary conditions. The French and the British weren't planning for a prolonged war, and as a result, many of their trenches were really muddy, really dirty, infested with rats, not clean, just horrific places to be in this conflict. Okay. So the American economy. Wilson ran on promises of the new freedom, that the way to run the economy is to have limited government intervention. He also ran on the promise of I kept us out of the war. Something interesting is going to happen. The American economy is going to be completely controlled by the United States government at this time. This is something that is very socialistic, goes completely against what most Americans at this time and today believe in, that free enterprise needs to be valued above all else, that there can't be regulation, especially that there can't be regulation on what prices are. So the War Industries Board, a major federal agency created to regulate wartime production, allocation of materials. The Fuel Administration controlled coal output, regulated fuel prices and consumption, and introduced daylight savings time. So there you go. We just ended daylight savings. Well, I'm making this on November 4th. So daylight savings just happened or ended right now. So Food Administration oversaw the production allocation of wheat, meat, and sugar to ensure supplies for the Army, as well as for the desperately food-short Allies. So they're setting up, they're regulating how much people can consume and how much they can purchase. And many Americans are going to believe in this war effort and sign pledges for Meatless Monday and Wheatless Wednesdays. Okay. And one of the positives is that World War I is going to be a time period where African Americans are going to have opportunities to leave the South and actually get good paying factory jobs in the North. There weren't that many laborers because many of them were drafted, went off to fight in the war, or were doing something else war-related. So the African Americans, many of the firearms were still segregated, so numbers were down, and many branches would not allow blacks to carry firearms. So many African Americans moved north to cities such as Chicago, New York City, and Detroit. And many important waves of cultural influence arose out of this movement, including the Harlem Renaissance and Motown. So you can see Great Migration from 1910 to 1970. The first Great Migration is primarily going to be over here. By World War II, many African Americans are going to go to Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, to search and find opportunities there. Okay. So the new freedom in action essentially is going to be all about organizing the economy, how the government is running the economy, and setting prices, all very un-American acts, essentially. And it's something that's incredibly progressive as well, is the government setting standards, regulations as well. But something else that's interesting is that this is going to be a time period where the United States is also going to expand democracy. 19th Amendment is officially passed in 1919, ratified in 1920, so women are able and allowed to vote at this time. This was all under Woodrow Wilson's presidency. And this is something where the 19th Amendment was a process. It wasn't all or nothing. As you can see, many women had full suffrage just before the 19th Amendment. Other states, they were allowed primary suffrage to vote in primaries. Some states, they were allowed to vote in presidential elections. Sometimes women were allowed to vote in primary suffrage in some cities, municipal suffrage, school, bond, or tax suffrage, and as you can see over here, absolutely no suffrage. And the reason why the West allowed full suffrage quickly was because they wanted to try to gain as many citizens, especially female citizens, as possible, so that families would settle out there, women would get up and move and go to the West as well, so that many of these states that needed to increase their populations would be able to either achieve statehood, gain more representation in the House of Representatives, or other things like that. Okay, so George Creel is also going to promote this idea of 100% Americanism, in which Americans are going to be all about supporting and taking care of being an American, and not trusting anything that feels foreign, or especially that feels German at this time. And so, yeah, George Creel is going to popularize this war through propaganda pieces. Wherever people turned, they would see posters, be encouraged to buy war bonds to support the war movement, anything like that. And also, there were people known as 4-Minute Men who would sing songs and support the war effort. Here is a picture of Liberty Bonds. As you can see, it's all about protecting liberty. Think about asking immigrants to think about when they were first coming to the United States and seeing the Statue of Liberty, and now that's what they're doing now, is that they're continuing this process of protecting liberty and extending it to other people across the sea. The Hun, his mark blotted out with Liberty Bonds, so need to take care of the Hun, need to fight the Hungarians, make sure that they are ended. American propagandists also demonized German culture, showing Germans as brutes who are embracing or taking over Lady Liberty. This is also before the Statue of Liberty was really popularized. America was typically personified by this figure known as Columbia. So this very well could be Columbia, who is in the arms of the brute, and German culture has destroyed Europe, and now it's going to threaten and destroy America as well. There are some people who draw comparisons between this picture and this one to suggest that within the American psyche that there are some of these racist ideas still, or caricatures that can still be applied to American media now today, I guess. So many people are believing in this 100% Americanism and believing in the threat of German and Hungarian culture. And so they're going to pass these acts known as the Espionage Act and the Sabotage and Sedition Act, which are actually going to imprison people who are spying, sabotage, or obstruction of the war effort, and also empower the postmaster to ban seditious materials from the mails, including all publications of the Socialist Party. So it's censoring people, preventing them from being able to comment or to essentially just the Socialist Party to say anything, just trying to protect the war effort by censoring people. And that's what the Sabotage and Sedition Act is as well, is that people would not be allowed to be disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive, make any comment of the U.S. government, the U.S. flag, or the armed services. Those convicted under the act generally receive sentences of imprisonment for 5 to 20 years. The Socialist Party candidate, Eugene Debs, who was a very famous and prominent man, ran for president multiple times, and in 1920 he ran for the presidency from jail and still received 1 million votes. And it was because he was criticizing the government for being involved in this conflict as well. So we can see that Wilson is embracing these ideas, saying that we need to censor people, that the military masters of Germany have filled our unsuspecting communities with vicious spies and conspirators and have sought to corrupt the opinion of our people. So he's making this point that the United States and its citizens need to be extra vigilant and watch out for anyone who appears to be un-American as well. Governor of Iowa, William L. Harding, issued a proclamation requiring that all oral communication be conducted in English. Harding said freedom of speech did not include the right to use a language other than the language of that country. So here are some other examples of 100% Americanism. Berlin Street and German Street became English and Woodward streets. You can see how streets were renamed. Books published in German were removed from libraries or burned. Sauerkraut became Liberty Cabbage. German measles became Liberty Measles. Hamburgers, Liberty Sandwiches, and the Dachshunds, Liberty Pups. So if you have a little wiener dog, that is a Liberty Pup. In Ohio State, the state legislature passed the Eichh Law, which banned the teaching of the German language in all schools below the 8th grade. In 1917, St. Louis city authorities established zones of the city where enemy aliens, Germans who were not citizens, were forbidden to live. Here's some parks where children cannot go if they're pro-German. So, and one of the tragedies of this time period is during this extra vigilant 100% Americanism, a German-American man named Robert Prager, who had even signed up for the military but was disqualified because of a health condition, was lynched. And he, in his final words in a letter that he wrote to his parents right before he was hanged, he wrote, "Dear parents, I must on the 4th day of April 1918 die. Please pray for me, my dear parents." And people actually were taken to court for, or taken to trial for the lynching and murder of Robert Prager, but they were all acquitted. And one person, an editor for the Collinsville Herald, wrote, "Outside a few persons who may still abhor Germanic inclinations, the whole city is glad that the 11 men indicted for the hanging of Robert P. Prager were acquitted. Monroe noted the community is well convinced that he was disloyal. The city does not miss him. The lesson of his death has had a wholesome effect on the Germanists of Collinsville, the rest of the nation." So they're justifying this lynching, this horrific act as well. Agents of repression. The post office is going to be responsible for monitoring any socialist or German publications, requiring people to also translate German newspapers into English. Vigilante mobs, protective leagues would spy on neighbors, tap phones, stage slacker raids, people who avoided the draft or didn't enlist. Protested the war, refused to buy war bonds. And so just this attack on anyone who didn't follow in with Americanism. So remember, this is what progressivism is all about, is that it is about 100% Americanism. It's about rooting out anything that appears to be against America or appears to be incompatible with a singular vision of what it means to be American as well. So taking care of or removing any language that disagrees with what the United States believes. The United States passed the Espionage... So, just reiterating all of this information, but this amendment was challenged in Schenck v. United States, in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. justified such repression in cases where a person's speech posed a clear and present danger to the nation. One of the reasons you can justify this is that we all have the freedom of speech, but there are consequences for that speech as well. Say, for instance, you go to a theater and you yell fire. If you cause or incite a small riot by yelling fire or something like that, you are responsible and liable to being arrested in the event that there are any damages or injuries to people as they try to flee from a burning building or what they think is a burning building. Okay, so that's the one way that we can think about this. Part of vigilantism is that another instance is that this German man or German American man who lived in Minnesota was tarred and feathered for people believing that he wasn't being American enough, not buying enough war bonds, appearing to be not being a good person either. And so there's just a lot of spying on neighbors, people being extra vigilant. And so a court sentenced an Ohio farmer, John White, to 21 months in prison for saying that the murder of innocent women and children by German soldiers was no worse than what the United States had done in the Philippines in the War of 1899 to 1903. And Debs was convicted for 10 years, or sentenced to 10 years, for delivering an anti-war speech, and he received nearly 1 million views. In the 1920s, President Warren G. Harding commuted Debs' sentence in 1921. And so we can see how the United States is kind of going crazy as a result of this 100% Americanism, and that a lot of this Americanism is going to attack primarily socialists as well. Let's see if this works. So yeah, be sure to just take your time reading this. Yeah, the Socialist Party had many members during the early 1900s, but lost almost all of its influence as a result of World War I and the attack on socialism as well. So, yeah, the industrial workers of the world, most active in the West among miners and loggers, but had success in the East among steel workers and textile workers. Wanted to unify all laborers, including the unskilled. The goal was one big union, espoused tactics of violence. Like the socialists, the IWW were ardent members of, were ardent opponents of World War I, a position that invited hostility and repression. Yeah, so you can take a look at what the IWW believed in. And yeah, as you can see, socialist mayors were all throughout the United States, primarily in the Midwest, but as you can see, there were quite a few in Oklahoma. And at this time, per capita, Oklahoma had the highest percentage of socialists in the nation. This was primarily because of the work that happened in Oklahoma, people working in oil fields, mines, and in agriculture. All these were very dangerous jobs, so they wanted the United States to take a bigger role in regulating and governing what these labor areas or labor sites as well. So that's just one of those fun facts. And one of the reasons why it was easy to turn socialists into the villain during this conflict is that many of these socialist mayors also had German last names. So you have Victor Berger from Milwaukee, I believe. Yeah, he was elected to House of Representatives and convicted in 1919 of violating the Espionage Act for speaking against the war a year earlier. And so, yeah, you just have all sorts of cases where the United States is upholding its decision to prevent speech as well. Okay, and over there, we see beginnings of tank warfare. It was just a bloody, violent war in which there were few gains. People would see many casualties without really understanding what they were getting, so morale was always low. There was also chemical warfare, the use of mustard gas being thrown into trenches, just a horrific, bloody war. And during this conflict, the Russian military was being poorly organized and run, and Russia was just suffering greatly, so the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the monarchy during that time as well. Armistice was passed in 1918, and so the question now becomes, how would the United States recover from this war? How would they make sure that this would never happen again? So Woodrow Wilson proposed 14 points, and be sure to look those up. They're all how to create a League of Nations and to prevent another war from breaking out as well. And so the conference, Versailles Peace Conference, focused specifically on punishing Germany. And this was one of the 14 points, was to go easy on Germany, to allow it to recover without passing too many sanctions against it. However, France and Great Britain were mostly in charge of this conference, and so they stripped Germany of its colonies, disarmed it, forced to admit sole blame for the war, and settled with staggering reparation payments, which caused crippling depression in Germany. France regained border provinces lost to Germany in 1871 to control of Germany's coal-rich Saar Basin for 15 years. The treaty demilitarized Germany's western border, transferred a part of eastern Germany to Poland. These provisions cost Germany 1/10 of its population and 1/8 of its territory, and a lot of its productive territory as well, and some of its access to the North Sea. So just a very crippling blow to Germany. Most of Germany's colonies were transferred to new countries, and Wilson's points about self-determination went unheeded. One of his 14 points was that self-determination needs to be protected, that we need to decolonize and allow these colonial nations to take care of themselves and allow them to have their own free elections. Ho Chi Minh tried to secure Vietnamese independence from France, but they would not allow it. So this is going to lead to the Vietnam War in the future. The Conference created Palestine, gave it to Great Britain, and these terms planted the seeds for World War II, the Vietnam War, and many other conflicts in the future. Wilson attempted to create a League of Nations to protect the 14 points and to create a police force where if you were a member of the League of Nations and an aggressor attacked you, then all of the other members of the League would attack the aggressor as well. However, Wilson was deteriorating physically at this time. He had lost the approval of Congress and suffered severe stroke. Many Americans were angry with Wilson for the way he handled his presidency. World War I was a disaster in many ways, especially how many Americans lost their lives. Many Americans came back speaking of how terrible the conflict was over there. Many people were frustrated with the vigilantism that broke out in the United States, and also for the government controlling the economy. After World War I and this involvement in internationalism, many Americans were ready to get back to business, reinstate the Monroe Doctrine and isolationist stance as well. So most of Congress amended the League of Nations, transforming it into a loose alliance between the U.S. and foreign nations. No one wanted to get entangled in a future war and preferred isolationism. Wilson would not approve these amendments, and very few people actually support the League of Nations. The U.S. was left out because they could not approve it. So here it is. This was something that Wilson strongly believed in, going all the way back to Wilsonianism. U.S. is the keystone, but they will not place it in there. Okay, so just the main point is that the United States did not trust Europe. And this distrust led to isolationism, where the old world and the new world would not interact. And Warren G. Harding is going to break with what these progressive presidents had done in the past, and is going to create a much more laissez-faire presidency, where he's not going to be active in the affairs of Americans, but is going to protect government, or is going to protect business interests instead. And so, yeah, that's all I have to say about America's internationalist stances during the turn of the century up through 1920. I'll be posting a lecture about the 1920s soon. Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.